Dr. JP Pawliw-Fry is a powerhouse in the leadership coaching arena. JP works with professional athletes as an advisor to the U.S. Army and Navy and consults for organizations like IBM, Mercedes-Benz, and Goldman Sachs, among others. He's also the co-founder and president of the Institute for Health and Human Potential. We chat about how to have that tough conversation and actually finish it, my friends. JP walks us through his last 8% culture system and is based on an enormous data set. So instead of getting through that first 80, 85, 90% of what we need to discuss, we can approach these conversations in thoughtful, relational, and effective ways. Hello, and welcome to The Communicative Leader, hosted by me, Dr. Leah O'Million Hodges. My friends call me Dr. O. I'm a professor of communication and a leadership communication expert. On The Communicative Leader, we're working to make your work life what you want it to be. JP, I cannot wait to geek out with you today about leadership and communication and these tough conversations. Thank you so much for joining us on The Communicative Leader. But before we dive into the ins and outs, can you tell us a little bit about what brought you into this area?
Yeah, because I have challenges personally with communication, probably. And maybe that's a bit trite to say, but we all do, don't we? I mean, I've studied this area for many years, and I still struggle with, having conversations with my senior team, with my business partner, with my 20-year-old son. So there's a real honest reason why I'm here, which is to learn first and foremost 25 years ago. But then kind of what brought me into the space is, working with athletes or people under pressure. That's kind of our area, as you know. But for listeners, it's we listen fairly well when we're not under pressure. But as soon as we're in those kind of moments where we're feeling judged, when we're feeling pressure to deliver a result, all of a sudden we're not as effective in both listening and communicating. So that's probably where, for me, it all started, Leah.
Yes, I love that. And like you said, I mean, I've been studying this a long time, and probably most days something comes out of my mouth and I think, oh, I wish I could have tweaked that, or I wish I had thought and pivoted just a little bit. So we recognize even when we immerse ourselves, there's always more to learn. So we have your background, we understand this passion, and before we dive headfirst into your approach for navigating these challenging conversations, can you help us understand what makes something a tough conversation? What are some of these common elements that you see?
Sure. I would even broaden it. We're going to talk obviously about conversations, but I would broaden it to the hard situations that we face. And in our research, we find that is definitely in conversations, but it's also in decisions. It's also in speaking up, even though that's not a one-to-one communication. It is definitely, or let's say one-to-one conversation. It's definitely communication, and it's critical if you want to be high performing. And so I would kind of more broadly kind of construe or think about this, number one. Number two, when we are feeling responsible for an outcome, when there's uncertainty to that outcome, these are some of the elements that then make it increase the pressure, increase what makes it a harder conversation. And then I kind of mentioned it earlier, when we are feeling kind of judged that we're responsible for that outcome, and when we feel personally judged, that's when a bunch of things happen in the brain that put us in a position where we perceive that this is a hard conversation. And so much of this is about perception. But boy, when we frame it in a certain way, when the certain elements are there and we frame it in a certain way, that's when we are in that place where we're not able to think as clearly, when we're not as able to listen as well or communicate as effectively.
When you were just talking, I was thinking of this as almost like a pressure trifecta. So we have responsibility for the outcome, we care about the outcome,
Yeah.
and then we have uncertainty
Right.
about the outcome. I mean, we can definitely look and say, "Yep, that's
Yeah.
a lot of challenge. It's a lot of pressure."
It is. It
S
is. And the bottom line that most people miss in
Mhm,
organizations is that the natural default behavior for most individuals,
mhm,
all individuals,
mhm,
is to default when they're facing that trifecta, is to
mhm,
default to protection, not risk.
mhm,
And they don't know it. We don't know it as managers, but that's what's going on. And so, unless there's some
mhm,
antidote, unless there's some way to manage that default to protection, not risk, we will continue to have people who won't speak up, who won't make
mhm,
hard calls, who won't put themselves in a position of being judged. And we are not even aware this is going on. That's the kind of crazy part in my mind.
mhm. I, kind of related. I've just talked to Dr. Ryan Beisel. I don't know if you know his work, but it's all employee voice and business ethics and speaking up. And he brought in lifelong socialization and how that implicit, even when we're a child, we kind of defer to adults. We know there's certain things that if we say the adult is going to be upset, and while it sounds silly saying it out loud, those implicit theories are still impacting us in the workplace as an adult. As you're saying, it's this protection mode and fear of retribution.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of our time is driven by something called impression management, which I know you
Hmm.
understand, but not maybe everyone on the
Hmm.
podcast does. But it's that we spend a lot of our day, a lot of our bandwidth is taken up. I wonder what they think about me.
Hmm.
Okay, I better manage that. And because we want to manage that, principally because we don't want to be excluded. As soon as we're excluded, then we are in a position where kind of almost genetically driven, we feel like we won't have access to resources or relationships that will ensure our
Hmm.
survival. And so as soon as we're in that situation, no wonder, those implicit theories we have inside that say, boy, I don't want to get excluded. I better not speak up. I better not do those things that,
Hmm.
again, are not, you know, protection, they're risk. So it goes literally against the
Hmm.
fabric of our brain. And that's why
Yep.
it's hard. And that's why if people
Hmm.
aren't given skills, if they don't have the right environment, they will continue to avoid. That's just
Hmm.
the truth. So
Yep.
you know that
Yeah.
about people.
The truth, and I'm sure the experience of many, unfortunately. So, one thing, and you've already mentioned this, and I found myself when I was preparing for our conversation thinking about perception. And we know that perceptions vary from person to person. So, I have a two-parter for you. So, one, how often in your work do you find one person is really agonizing or fretting over something, and then to find out the conversation partner isn't? And then, second, what is that perception of the tough conversation versus this is just business? Right?
Yeah.
Just really direct to the point, removing feelings. And they're like, it's just business. It's not a tough conversation.
Yeah. That's a really great question. I think because the brain is trying to protect the body,
Hmm.
because of that reason, we default to protection, not risk. It jumps to judgment based on less than 5% of available information, which is an alarming stat. And because of that, the brain as it processes incoming information, it prioritizes speed over accuracy. Oh, that's interesting.
Hmm.
So, in that moment, the brain is going to do everything it can to make sure that it saves the body. So, it's going to prioritize speed over accuracy. It's going to jump
Hmm.
to judgment based on less than 5%. And it's in that moment that we can sit there. Let's say I'm looking at you or I'm looking at a conversation partner and they have some look on their face. The brain, its job is to keep us safe. So it's going to sit there and actually jump to judgment with less accuracy than, speed and go, am I at risk? And is that person, what does that face mean? Huh.
Hmm.
And that's when we can confuse the impact they are legitimately having, not
Hmm.
legitimately, that they are having on us
Hmm.
for their intention. So that's one of the first gaps for sure that
Mm-hmm.
we fall into. And I think that point that they're not thinking about us, we're sitting there worried that they're not even thinking of us. I read this, I don't know how many years ago, in our 30s, 40s, and 50s, we worry about what other people think of us. In our 60s, we stop worrying about what
Mm-hmm.
people think of us. And in our 70s, we realize that we're never thinking about us in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
And so, it's the same idea.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one big part, which is the first question you asked. The second question, though, is interesting as well, which is, based on what I just said, and again, the research, we can have different frames for the same situation. And so I might see that as, let's say I'm new on a team. Let's say I don't have as much experience. Let's say internally, even I have some insecurities. So there's multi factors, but I'm in that conversation with you, and I'm now thinking, huh, you just gave me some feedback. Is my job at risk? Is my livelihood? And on and on and on. And you, who might have more, seniority, more experience, more confidence, more many things, more understanding of how business works or doesn't work, and how this culture is or isn't, whatever. So many factors. You might be seeing it as, no, this is just business. I'm just giving you
Mm-hmm.
feedback. It's nothing more than that. It's nothing personal. So it's interesting how, again, we can construe something as very
Mm-hmm.
personal or not personal. And because of that, it's that we can be two different conversations. I think my
Yes.
job's at
Mm-hmm.
stake. You're like, no, I just need to get this done. By the way, I'm not even saying that it means we don't take into consideration emotion. Of course, any
Mm-hmm.
effective leader would.
Yep.
But that's just more data, more information. It's not necessarily, or it shouldn't be, the driving factor in
Mm-hmm.
what gets communicated, what accountability gets created or not, what kind of listening do you want to really tune into, so that person and you with them can help manage their brain, manage that emotion, so they can hear you. So
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this is why your podcast is so awesome, is there's so many levels, so many layers, and this is some of the hardest stuff we do as humans. And so it kind of
Mm-hmm.
behooves us to get a little bit better at it.
Yes, thank you. I think a lot of times the communication, my brain will literally almost short circuit because I think about all of the complexity and the layers and the factors at play. And I always tell people it's amazing. People arrive at organizations or log on at approximately the same time, like that this work gets done because of how much complexity there is. And one thing I was smiling about when you were talking, when I was a PhD student, I taught a public speaking course, and I wish I had the exact citation, but in our
Hmm.
textbook, and this was, I think it was a citation from the 40s or 50s, because now, it would be frowned upon to bring an air horn in your classroom and just randomly
Hmm.
let it go off when you wanted. But what the gentleman was doing was, once the students heard the air horn, they had to write down immediately what they were thinking about. And this is when there were speeches going on, the teacher was instructing, and it was like essentially lunch. What am I doing
Mhm.
after school? Like, does he or she or they like me? Right? So all of these things completely outside of what was going on. And I love that that's how this public speaking text started, to say,
Mm.
this is a huge moment for you. But so and so, they're thinking about their sandwich, and they're
Yeah.
thinking about what they've
Yeah.
got to do afterwards.
Yeah. Like it's a great point.
Mm-hmm.
Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, which I know his work around flow.
Mm-hmm.
They use a beeper system, less a foghorn or a big blasting horn, but
Yeah.
they literally, they've had this, and they've done this for years, where
Mhm,
they beep an individual and they write down what they were thinking, and 50% of the time they weren't thinking
mhm.
about anything that had anything related to the moment. They're
Yep.
lost. I mean, by the way,
Mhm,
that's why mindfulness, for anyone listening, you
mhm,
need to do mindfulness, or you
mhm,
need to have some internal technology. Mindfulness is by far the most
mhm,
studied, the most effective. You need to have some form of internal technology that says, oh, maybe I'm not present right now. Or
Mm-hmm.
my mind's wandering. I don't have to believe every thought I have.
Yep.
And so, you know, I love your story. That's a great one. And I just sit here and I think for everyone listening, what's the takeaway? People are thinking about themselves more than anything. They're
Yes.
more
Yeah.
worried. Do I have something on my, clothes?
Mm-hmm.
Do I have something in my teeth?
Mm-hmm.
They're not actually looking at us, thinking about us that often. And
Mm-hmm.
that's actually I hope, freeing for
I
people.
agree.
And
I
if
agree.
anything, the next level, I would even suggest
Mm-hmm.
this, the next level, if we truly want to be exceptional in our how we live our lives, our effectiveness, etc., can we in that moment actually sit there and have empathy for the person that we're with and sit there and go, I wonder what their suffering is? Because as
Mm-hmm.
soon as you can tune into that, yourself evaporates. You don't think about yourself. You're more thinking, oh, I wonder if they had a tough morning. Oh, I wonder what's going on for them. And then all of a sudden you can be, a lot more of a service mentality, a lot more of a serving energy. And that's, by the way, now you're not thinking about me and what I have to say and the worries I have about this presentation or whatever performance
Mm-hmm.
moment we're facing. That's actually the next level. And again, this is all possible to train on,
Mm-hmm.
but it's got to be disciplined practice or
Yes.
else,
Yep.
you know, none of us will be able to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I like that shifting from I to we,
Mm,
right?
absolutely.
So, JP, I'm sure you have heard every reason for not wanting to engage in a challenging conversation. So, what are these obstacles that people often will tell you? Like, I'd love to have that conversation, or I'd love to think about this, but what, fill in the blank for us.
Yeah. I mean, like the reasons that people don't have the conversation
Yeah.
potentially. Yeah. Well, yeah, great question. Boy, so many reasons. And we're very creative. We're
Mhm,
exceptional at being creative for
mhm,
avoidance.
mhm, mhm.
In our data, we find that when you're facing a difficult conversation, there's two principal ways that we default, and we call this our predictable default behavior. So each of us has a pattern. When I
Okay.
work with athletes, I see this not so much in conversation, although it certainly can be there, but when they're facing pressure, kind of what their pattern is. And so this comes from our work with athletes, maybe originally, um, in some ways, to look for patterns at least. And what's interesting is if I'm having to have a conversation with you, um, and I struggle with these conversations, um, and just I need to step even one point back. I
Mhm,
think you know this, but we did a study of 34,000 people where we found
mhm.
that there is about 8% of what we don't want to say. It's the hard part of a
Yep.
conversation. It's the most important parts of the conversation.
Mhm,
It's the part that might have consequences for you. And because now I'm having that,
mhm,
moving into that last 8%, I've gotten past 85 and 90, getting to 92. And as I move into the last 8% and I see that you're starting to get a bit triggered, a bit, you know, um,
mhm,
emotional because you see where this conversation is going. You see the consequences. I get infected by your emotion. And as opposed to stepping in and facing it, I
mhm,
do one of two things. I either, and this is 68% of us in our data, I avoid it. And I come up with all these creative
mhm,
solutions, as you pointed out. Or um, let's say I've been thinking about having this conversation for a couple of days with you, and I'm up at 3 a.m. and my mind, and I'm thinking about it, ruminating. And now it's 10 a.m. or 11 a.m. and I'm having the
mhm,
conversation with you. And I just, you know, feel like, okay, I finally got the courage to actually speak up. And what do? I speak up.
mhm,
And that's
mhm,
like the worst possible thing I could do. The single worst possible thing I could
mhm,
do. Because I don't really know what's on your side of the bridge. I've jumped to judgment based on less than 5% of available information.
mhm,
I feel certain and right. And it's in that moment, especially where we don't speak up, but we start by being curious. That's part of our
mhm.
model. Be curious,
Yep.
then speak up. Not speak up, then be curious. And it matters because you're going to get us you're going to give me a whole bunch of information that I'm going to go, oh, that's it. I didn't know that. Huh.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, and that might change what I say in the speaking up side. So be curious, speak up really matters.
Mm-hmm.
And so in some ways, if we can sit there and think, okay, in having a hard conversation, what I'm really doing is getting more than 5% of available information.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just going to really stand in the be curious side. In some ways, that might make it a lot easier for us to think about, contemplate having a hard conversation,
Mm-hmm.
which might be a bit of an antidote to the creative ways that we avoid. So imagine everyone who's listening, 68, 2/3 of us avoid,
Mm-hmm.
32% of us, a third almost, make a mess, right? So that's the point that I was saying. So I've been thinking about it all night. Now I'm going to have the conversation, and now I launch in, I come on way too strong. I
Mm-hmm.
come in hot, and I have impact I don't intend. That's what we think of as that other side. So of 68% of us avoid, 32% of us make a mess,
Mm-hmm.
right? When we struggle with the last 8% conversation.
Yeah. And I like the simplicity in being curious and then speaking up. Because I think if we speak up first, like you say, with coming in hot, not thinking about it, then we can be curious about the amount of damage we've done.
Right.
And the reverse, it sounds a lot better.
Oh, it does. And by the way, like
Yeah.
in some ways, it it may not. I might be grasping at straws here, but I actually
Mm-hmm.
think it slightly takes the pressure off. If I'm going to have a conversation, I'm
Mm-hmm.
just going to start by being curious. I don't have to say anything. In fact, we talk about
Mm-hmm.
it as having kind of really two conversations,
Mm-hmm.
right? In the first conversation, I'm actually making the commitment not to speak my truth,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right? I'm actually sitting there thinking about, like in meeting one, it's just, hey, help me understand, Leo, what was going on in that
Yeah.
meeting,
Mm-hmm.
right? And you might say, well, what do you think, Jay? I'm trying to learn right now. I'm just trying to listen. I'm
Mm-hmm.
trying to be curious, whether you use that language or not. That's what we're trying to do. Because here's what happens. If you're sitting there, I'm asking you the question, I'm being curious, but really I'm just waiting until I can speak up. You're going to sense that in me. You're going to go, and that's not going to make you feel less
Mm-hmm.
anxious. My goal is to make you feel less anxious, make you feel safe enough to be in the
Mm-hmm.
conversation. Now, I can't control everything, of course,
Mm-hmm.
but there's a bunch of things I can do. Ask questions. That helps
Mm-hmm.
you manage your brain, interestingly enough. Be curious. And then say, and this can be unfulfilling for the other person to say, okay, listen, thank you. That's really helpful. I'm going to think about this. Let's talk again tomorrow. And
Mm-hmm.
even when I start meeting two tomorrow, I'm like, so Leah, we had a good conversation yesterday. Was there anything new that you thought of since we talked? Okay, now I can,
Mm-hmm.
like, you feel heard,
Mm-hmm.
right? I have been curious. And look, none of us are perfect at this. And now I can move to part two, which is speak up. Okay. So it sounds like this is going on. This is going on. Great. Um, from my side of the bridge, here's how I'm seeing things. Maybe we're seeing it differently. Here's what we're trying to do to build the culture on our team, to have high accountability. And for what just happened, that's not acceptable.
Mm-hmm.
That behavior is not acceptable. I think I understand what went on for you, but that's not what we're trying to build here.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, there's a whole bunch of ways, of course, that we can kind of communicate that, which
Mm-hmm.
is to understand that I'm trying to make you feel safe. Again, I
Mm-hmm.
can't control it all, but do everything I can so that you understand I'm not on purpose, because your brain will go there, as we already talked
Yep.
about. I'm trying to make you recognize I'm not just trying to rip you up because I'm
Mm-hmm.
a, sadist or a masochist. Which
Mm-hmm.
one is it? When you want to impart pain on someone else,
I know. I
I think
think
that's
the
a sadist.
sadist. Yep.
I
I
think it
think
is, because a
with our
masochist,
powers combined.
that's right. So I don't want to be, by the way, you
Yeah.
shouldn't probably say it if you don't know the word, less, note to
We're both going to
JP.
be Googling right after.
Exactly.
Yes. And I imagine too, I don't know this literature well, but I imagine when you're curious and asking questions and coming from a place of listening, that's automatically going to slow your brain. which is going to be really helpful here.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Absolutely. I mean, we have to manage ourselves, manage others if we're a
Mm-hmm.
manager, people leader,
Mm-hmm.
with the brain in mind. I think
Yep.
this is a big leap in the last 10 years of management
Mm-hmm.
studies. We're starting to recognize that, neuroscience has a place. And by the way, for a lot of folks in organizations, I think they walk away learning some of the stuff. So I think you know this, but that's what we do. We help organizations
Mm-hmm.
create high performing cultures in months, not years. And so that's
Mm-hmm.
that's our whole purpose. And the thing is that for when someone understand when they go through some of our learning, they understand the brain, how it works. All of a sudden, they're like, "Oh my God, you just described me." That's
Mm-hmm.
helpful. But hopefully, they also understand that this explains the person who they're having a conversation with or doing whatever with. And
Mm-hmm.
we our goal is to help challenge people to become students of human behavior. So as soon as you
Mm-hmm.
get that, all of a sudden you almost don't even need the techniques and all of the other stuff. I mean, we all do. We need to be prepared,
Mm-hmm.
et cetera, et cetera. But
Yep.
because it all makes sense, it's just like kind of riding a bike. Oh, of course I'm going to be
Mm-hmm.
curious first because I got to help you
Yes.
manage your brain. So
Mm-hmm.
it's not even like I have to, oh, what's the next thing? No, I just know I can't
Yep.
come in and just start
Mm-hmm.
launching, jumping to judgment, being
Mm-hmm.
certain versus curious.
Yes. Yes. And I love that about your organization. Because I always think as an organizational scholar, if we have more people immersed in healthy, pro-social, other-oriented cultures, our whole lives would be so much different.
For
Right?
sure.
I mean, you know that. This is
No,
your day
for
in and
sure.
day out.
No, you're right.
Mhm.
And I think the principal goal of an organization is not, to be nice to their employees. It's not to be a family. None of that. It's to grow a business that adds value so you can
Mhm.
employ more people. You can just get whatever results you want to fulfill whatever purpose you want. But if you get all of this stuff, then you start to recognize how I go about doing that is
Mhm.
completely different when I know the brain, when I understand what makes people tick. So
Mhm.
now it is to make them have some experience in your organization where they have a voice, where they feel valued. But that's not the goal. That's a means
Mhm.
to the goal. And
Yeah.
that's where sometimes I think organizations, folks in HR get it wrong. They think,
Mhm.
the goal is to make people feel good. It's not. The goal is to be a family. It's not.
No.
Right. So,
Mhm.
but again, if you understand how it all works together, then you sit there and go, why would I ever jump into command and control? Like I might
Mhm.
because that's my default because I make a
Yep.
mess. But if I understand myself and I go, okay, that's my default. I've got to have an antidote. I've got to have a kind of coaching. I've got to have whatever it is to help me manage that.
Mhm.
But at the end of the day, I kind of recognize command and control is not going to, or bullying or
Mhm.
interrupting or whatever, not giving people voice, not making people feel valued. That's not actually going to help me get to my goal, which is, again,
Mhm.
whatever your goal is, right?
Yeah.
Because, there's this great Japanese proverb, which I love. All of us are smarter than any one of us. I
Mhm.
love that because it's like,
Mhm.
that's why you want people engaged.
Mhm.
That's why you want them feeling commitment,
Yeah.
employee commitment,
Mhm.
because they're like, I'm valued. I have
Mhm.
voice. I feel connected. And now because of that, I can be courageous. I can speak up. I can do
Mhm.
whatever it is that's hard.
Yeah. So we put that investment in our people. And I think, too, people fail to see the compound of that and recognizing that we get to that goal even quicker because then that's how they treat our vendors and our
That's a
employee,
good
like
point.
our customers. I mean, it doesn't just stop with the employee base. We're transforming the way we're interacting with these external publics.
It's a great point. I mean, our reputation um, catches up to us.
Mm-hmm.
It does. How we
Yep.
treat people. Maybe not for 6 months or a year or 5 years,
Mm-hmm.
but eventually it does.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Like when
Agreed.
you're a leader where it's really just about you, when you're not,
Mm-hmm.
you might say, I represent you. I like you can say a whole bunch of things, but when people see over and over that you're not really interested in anything but yourself. In fact, you may not even be interested in the company's goals. You're just interested in yourself. They're going to start walking away.
Mm-hmm. So, JP, we've got the solid understanding of tough conversations under our belt, and now I'd love to learn more about your renowned system, the last 8% principle, and transforming those tough conversations.
Yeah. So, this is our culture change system, and there's a couple of really important points to know. And again, people don't get this. Like, there's a whole bunch of myths. So, first myth is, actually, let me step back and say this. For an organization, we think our strategy is our competitive advantage. It's not. If you have a good strategy, people will copy it, right? Of course. So that's not a competitive advantage, right? A point of difference. People think, oh, our product, that's going to be our competitive advantage. And again, it's copyable.
Yep.
Is that even a word, copyable?
We can replicate it. Yeah.
Well, I used it.
I think we should go with copyable. Yeah.
Okay. So, your strategy's
Mhm.
copyable, your product's copyable. The thing that's
Mhm.
not copyable is your
Yep.
culture. Your
Mhm.
culture is not, and there's organizations like, oh, we want to create, remember HP used to have the HP way many years ago, and people
Mhm.
tried to copy it, or, copy Google or copy
Yep.
whoever. I mean, we all know the different ones that people try to copy, and that's impossible.
Mhm.
And there's a whole reason why, which I'll talk about now, but it's impossible to copy culture. And because of that, your culture becomes your competitive advantage. It is the difference maker. It's why you can collaborate, and why you can do hard things, and why you can be innovative, and why you can bring on, smart people who can do great things. Like, it's not strategy copyable. It's not products copyable.
Mhm.
It is absolutely culture. So let's dig into that a little bit. Why can't your culture be copied? Because of how it's created. Culture is not, let's do an offsite as a senior team and come up with 4 or 5 values that we think, okay, that's our culture. No, culture comes from the hard moments. Culture comes from the last 8% moments, because when we're under pressure in the last 8%, there's more cortisol in our brain. Cortisol is a stress
Mhm.
hormone. One of the effects of cortisol is that it sears in memory in a more profound way. And so, as a leader, you can be great 92% of the time, but now you're in the last 8% situation with your team. Everyone's got more cortisol in their brain, let's say, because it's last 8%, literally by definition. It's a hard moment. People are feeling the pressure. Whatever decision you make in that moment, whatever behavior you engage in, that literally gets seared into their brain. And that creates really 2 things. One, your reputation as a leader. And number 2, the culture on this team. The silent
Mhm.
signal that says this behavior is acceptable. This behavior is rewarded on this team. And so that's why culture is not copyable, because everyone has different last
Mhm.
8% situations, and they deal with it differently. So it's what people get wrong. So
Mhm.
that's an important
Yep.
point, number 1. Number 2, culture does not exist across organizations. This is another fallacy.
Mhm.
Culture exists principally on teams. That's the fundamental unit of culture. It's why you can have 2 hospital floors doing the same work, let's say oncology, with the same values on the wall, in the same hospital, door to, like, floor to floor, right? Like,
Mhm.
not even separated geographically, really. And you have staff that go back and forth between the floors. I worked in a couple of hospitals a couple of times, and I've seen this, but we've seen this definitely with our clients. And yet, even in those situations where everything's the same, including the staff, there's one difference which I'll mention in a second, but including the staff that goes back and forth, you can have completely different cultures on the floor. Why? Right? And what kind of different cultures? You
Mhm.
can have some that people are absolutely happy to help, pitch in even on their breaks. And on the other, people are seemingly more selfish, just don't really care what's going on for anyone else but themselves. They're not going to pitch in, give that extra kind of discretionary effort. What's the difference? The only difference is you have managers who do not float between one floor or the other, because it's the manager that drives the culture
Mhm.
on that floor based on their modeling of hard moments in the last 8% because of the cortisol effect. And so what's interesting is, again, organizations get it wrong. They're like, oh, culture exists across the organization. No. Oh, here are the values. This is our culture. No, culture comes from your hard moments. That's why you need people who have skills to manage their brain in hard moments. And so that's what creates, and that's why it's not copyable. That's why it is your competitive advantage. And that's why in our culture change system, the big aha, I think, for a lot of people is those last 8%, those hard moments that most people struggle with, they avoid, they make a mess of. We help them see it differently. I think you'll appreciate this, Leah, because you know this kind of literature, but we help them see it differently, not as, something to fight or avoid or construe as a negative. So last 8%, we want them to see differently, not as the worst thing that could happen, but as something that does happen and is your biggest opportunity to transform yourself and your, leadership capability, but more so the culture on your team. So the last 8% we call it the last 8% opportunity. You will, as an organization, face hard things.
Yeah.
So can you become the most courageous organization in your industry? Can you create a culture where we will be uncomfortable because our default is to protection, not risk? If you can norm all of this and say, look, in our organization, you're not always going to be comfortable, but that's okay because we want to be what we call an upper right-hand quadrant culture, which is, a high performing culture that has both high connection and high courage.
Yeah.
So we have a map that kind of describes all of this. But and so fundamentally we say, people leader, it's up to you, not the CEO or CHRO. It's up to you to actually own the culture on your team. Here's the structure to do it, not even with us as like a third party vendor. We give them the tools so they can do it using some, innovative approaches like a 4-week sprint and some other things. And we're so excited about this, as I think you can probably tell.
Yeah, that is, I love just the reframe. This doesn't have to be scary. This doesn't have to be a negative, but it's an opportunity to demonstrate how we do things here.
Right. Right. And by the way, it's not like you have a choice because you will face hard moments. Everyone does. That's
Exactly.
just life. So it's almost funny. Some CEOs and CHROs that get overwhelmed, like, I got to own the culture. You don't, but they think they do.
Yeah.
And then they think, oh my gosh, how do we do this across a large organization? And then, so they do nothing. And I understand that, by the way. Like, as a president of our company, I know that feeling. I got to get things done. I don't have time to work on the culture on the team. I totally get that. But here's the thing. The hard moments aren't going away. So you might put your head in the sand and say, we're not going to focus on culture, but your culture is being created right now. Everyone listening, on your team, when you hit a hard moment, your culture is being created, co-created, really. So you don't really have a choice. And so what happens is culture gets created by default, not by design.
Yeah, by default, not by design. Exactly. So, JP, I love the system, my organizational brain, my communication brain, my leadership. It's just all lit up. And I'm thinking, how can we kind of lean into this into other areas of our life? So whether it's, a contractor we've hired or something with a family member or a friend, is there a way we can kind of apply these ideas to these tough conversations?
Yeah, absolutely. So, to really see them for what they are, the biggest opportunity to transform ourselves when we go through a hard moment, it's our biggest opportunity to transform ourselves and the biggest opportunity to transform a relationship. So number one, we have to really buy into that. If we don't, then forget it, turn off the podcast now,
Yeah.
Number one. Number two, it won't be easy. You will struggle because of the way the brain is. And you almost have to accept that you will be somewhat incompetent in the early going of doing this. It's not going to magically happen that you're going to get effective at this kind of thing. And if you can see every opportunity to have one of these conversations as an opportunity to practice in order to transform, then time will have, like a year from now, if you and I were on the call, we're having the same conversation and listeners are listening in. Listeners, if you spent the last year, every time you could possible, have this conversation, being a little less competent at first, a little more competent in the middle, and maybe more competent at the end. In a year, you actually are going to get better. And because you're better now, you're going to have a confidence. And because you're going to have a confidence, you will be looked on very differently by the people around you. And this will drive a lot of your career. So that you just got to buy into this to start, right? It's like, when I work with athletes, I don't work with them for a day or a week or a month. It's years. It takes time, right? To kind of create these neural pathways in our brain. There's no easy fix. Sorry, everyone, no easy fix. Having said that, there's a whole bunch of things we can do. Start a mindfulness practice today, 10 minutes a day. We know that changes the brain, helps you see your thoughts for what they are, and helps you not be as affected by pressure. Number one. So do that. Number two, we're in the golden age of education. Like there's so much, like this podcast, there's so much great opportunity to listen and learn. You got to be an aggressive learner and jump in and do that. So that's kind of number two. Number three, I would, if listener, if you're in like well, it doesn't even matter what kind of job, but if you can spend either money on coaching, though it doesn't have to be a paid coach, it can be a good friend, but generally speaking, it's better if it's a paid coach because they have expertise to use your coach. I slightly joke, but not really. For the last 13 years, I've either had a coach or a therapist. When my life's going well, it's a coach. When it's not going so well, it's a therapist. But in either case, it's that person who I can bounce an idea off and say, hey, I'm struggling with this. And we literally walk through it. So there's a whole template. I mean, that's what our organization does, is we help people learn the whole template of how to do all of these things so you can show up. And yes, you will feel uncomfortable, but you'll show up with a little bit more confidence to step in and do the hard thing. What's amazing is that you do it a few times and you start to go, oh, that wasn't so bad. And you had said this earlier, I had made this big story up about how they were thinking or what's going on. And in fact, they weren't even thinking that. They're like, they're upset because, something's going on in their family, or that look on their face was they had gas, whatever. Like, that's a little too funny, but it's just like, and this is where we need to become students of human behavior.
Yes, I think there's so much power to in acknowledging that it's likely to feel uncomfortable, that it's likely to be a struggle. And that takes me back when I had my first child. I was looking at a parenting podcast, and the woman said, it's hard because it's hard, not because you're doing it wrong. And it was like a light bulb epiphany moment. Like, oh, yes, this is just hard and it's okay. It doesn't mean that I'm failing here. And it does get easy. You build up some confidence, but you recognize this might always be a challenge. And if we recognize that, it becomes a lot easier.
Absolutely.
Perfect. So I have two final questions for you, and they connect. So on the communicative leader, I really like to leave listeners with very tangible, pragmatic leadership or communication tips that they can integrate right away. So a first question for our leaders out there, managers, directors, supervisors, and then for our employees of all ranks. So what do you want to leave them with?
Yeah. When you're needing to have a hard conversation, first and foremost, be curious, then speak up. Be curious, speak up. Be curious, speak up. In a meeting, as you start a hard conversation, really dig into being curious as opposed to certain. You have an idea about what's going on. You're probably wrong. So get more than 5% of available information. To me, that's like absolutely critical. The other thing I would say is this is a really helpful tip that helps me a lot, and it may, because it's slightly out of context, it may sound funny to folks, but it'll probably make sense. When we start that conversation, so I've been curious, and now I'm about to speak up, to actually start with a little bit of vulnerability. So, Leah, if you and I are having a conversation, I've been curious. I'm really trying to understand what happened in that meeting. So this is the second big tip. It's to start with, hey, Leah, I'd love to, I really want to have a conversation about this, but I have to tell you, this is the being vulnerable part. I'm a little nervous. I'm anxious because I don't want to upset you, or I don't want to have you be upset with me. I value our relationship. So I'm a little anxious right now. And even just doing that, all of a sudden you're like, oh, like your heart slightly
Mm-hmm.
opens and you're
Yep.
like, oh, he's not trying to cut me off. And he's feeling a bit
Mm-hmm.
nervous and anxious right now. And that changes how you see my intention in this moment. And that
Mm-hmm.
matters. So two things, listeners, be curious, speak up. And then as you initiate the conversation, especially the speak up part, name how you're feeling.
Mm-hmm.
Name it. Say,
Yep.
I'm feeling whatever. Like for me, that's often what I feel. So that's why it's well
Mm-hmm.
practiced.
Mm-hmm.
And because I do want and I'm an avoider, by the way, like I'm the avoider, make a mess. I'm an avoider. So for me, it's like, it takes me a while to actually have a hard conversation, but I've really learned to start with that being a bit vulnerable. And look, at the end of the day, we can't control what another person's going to do, but this increases the probability that it will be successful.
Mm-hmm. And just think of the power, especially if we have a formal leader who says, I just need to let you know, going into this, I'm feeling a little anxious, or I really value this relationship. And so I'm feeling nervous.
Absolutely.
Yeah. We're role modeling that,
Yeah.
this is part of the workplace. Like you say, we're shaping culture in such
Right.
positive ways.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's actually a really great point as well. So when you're vulnerable, listener, just say, hey, I'm a little anxious. I don't want you to upset you, get you upset with me, but I'm doing this because I really take my job as a leader seriously. And I think
Mm-hmm.
these are the moments, as we all talked about, we want to build this last 8% culture. These are the moments that create, our culture. And so even though I'm a bit uncomfortable, I'm still going to have the conversation because of that really important purpose. And so I hope you can see that and hope we can have this conversation in a good way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's taking a lot of what we already have playing in our minds that is
Right.
invisible and then
Right.
helping to just make that clear for
Ab-
others.
Absolutely.
Excellent. Well, JP, thank you so much for being on The Communicative Leader. It was really a delightful conversation. I've learned so much, and I know our listeners will as well.
Oh, absolutely. My pleasure. Thank you, Leah. The good work you're doing, I know it's making a difference. So it was my pleasure to be on.
All right, my friends, that wraps up our conversation today. Until next time, communicate with intention and lead with purpose. I'm looking forward to chatting with you again soon on The Communicative Leader.